Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the National Organization for Women in Dollar for Dollar Now, from pay equity to paid leave, the push for economic justice. As folks continue to join, we invite you to let us know in the chat box where you're joining us from tonight. To cover just some basic housekeeping, we will be doing our best to keep the conversation to 1 hour. We will have a Q&A session toward the end of the hour and would love to hear from you all. So please type your questions for our panelists in the Q&A box and use the chat box for comments and reflections. Please understand that we try our very best to answer as many questions as possible as we balance our time together tonight. And with that, I would love to welcome our moderator for tonight's event, now National Vice President Bear Atwood.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bear Atwood. I'm the Vice President at NOW, and I use she, her pronouns. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's forum. In our society, money is equated with financial freedom, the freedom to live independently in a safe home, to take care of medical needs, and to provide for your family and future. But tragically, these freedoms are being denied to women in drastic ways. Women face stark barriers to financial security, including the gender discrimination in the workplace, an imbalance of responsibilities in the home, and a lack of access to safe and affordable child care, caregiving assistance, or family leave benefits. Women are more likely to face poverty than their male counterparts. In fact, women continue to face poverty rates higher than men in every age category. This is partly due to the wage gap. Women still only make 82 cents on every dollar that men make. And sadly, this disparity is much worse for BIPOC women, lesbian and transgender women, women with disabilities, and mothers. Women also dominate in professions that are historically undervalued and underpaid, including making up the majority of the service industry workers who are paid sub-minimum wage. The COVID-19 pandemic heightened an already precarious financial position for women in the US and illustrated like never before why lawmakers must address such inequities immediately. Women are facing a historic she-cession, and those working in childcare, restaurant service, and the domestic worker industries are being hit the hardest. These losses are emblematic of larger issues, as women's economic security is precarious even under the best of conditions. That is why we invited our expert panel with us tonight to engage in an important conversation about how we can ensure economic justice for women now and in the decades to come. First, it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Elise Gould, a senior economist for the Economic Policy Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. Elise conducts research on employment, wages, inequality, poverty, and childcare, and is co-author of The State of Working America, 12th edition. She has also co-authored a book on health insurance coverage and retirement, and has been published in venues such as the Chronicle of Higher Education and numerous academic journals. She is frequently quoted by major national news media, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, and she's testified before Congress on economic issues. We're excited she'll be bringing her unique expertise to our panel this evening, but first we look forward to hearing her remarks, which will provide the perfect framework we need for this vital discussion. Welcome, Elise.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides. Hopefully you're able to see them. So I'm going to start by discussing the state of the labor market, what happened in the pandemic recession, what the recovery has looked like, and why women were hit harder. Then I'm going to talk about the gender wage gap and its persistence over time, even in some of those essential industries that were kept afloat and so important during the pandemic. So before the pandemic hit, we were sitting at about 152.5 million jobs in the US economy. Then we intentionally policymakers intentionally shuttered millions of businesses for public safety, meaning job losses in the order of 22 million. And that's where you see that steep fall in employment. Policymakers provided workers and their families with expanded unemployment insurance and checks to weather the storm so that people could continue to pay their rent and put food on the table. As businesses reopened, the bounce back has been tremendous. In the last year alone, the US labor market has added about 6.5 million jobs, a record pace. Because of relief and recovery measures, this recovery is about 8 years faster than the recovery from the Great Recession. So now let's look at it by gender. This is looking at the change in employment from February 2020 for men and women. What you can see is that women were hit harder. They lost about 15%, 15.5% of jobs compared to about 13% for men in the first 2 months of the pandemic recession. In part, they lost more jobs because of school and childcare closures, but in part also because of occupational segregation. What we have seen over the last year and a half is a tremendous recovery for both men and women. Now, women have recovered close to as much as men have, but men still are closer to a full recovery than women are. So why is this? So I mentioned caregiving, and we're going to get into that later in the panel, but another reason is occupational segregation. And that is that some occupations are more likely to be filled by women. Some jobs are more likely to be filled by women, more likely to be filled by Black and Hispanic workers, who also saw much larger losses in the pandemic recession than their white counterparts. And so we look at where those jobs were. Leisure and hospitality experienced the greatest losses in the spring of 2020. These are the job losses that happened between February and April of 2020. And they remain the sector with the single largest job shortfall since then. So we see the shortfall. This is much smaller, obviously, than we saw in the initial huge job losses. But still, leisure and hospitality, we're still down about 1.5 million jobs since February 2020. The two other sectors with significant shortfalls continue to be the public sector. And there I'm talking about state and local jobs. And within that, a lot of those are education jobs, and the overall private sector, education and health services sector. Again, also many education jobs, but on the private sector side. And these sector distinctions matter. This recession is very different from the last recession, which hit manufacturing and construction, male-dominated professions. That was what was hit much harder. Here, the sectors with the continued job shortfalls are disproportionately women or female-dominated. As I mentioned, this is also called occupational segregation. Workers are segregated into certain jobs or professions by gender, and oftentimes by race or ethnicity as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit more about one sector where women are more common. So the three sectors that I mentioned, leisure and hospitality with the largest shortfalls, leisure and hospitality, the public sector, and education health services. Here I'm showing you that women in the lighter blue are much more likely to be in those sectors, particularly in the public sector and education and health services. So you see they have much more employment in those areas by millions of jobs. When we compare what happened in the public sector specifically with what happened in the private sector, you can see that in the darker blue, the private sector job losses were much steeper than the public sector job losses. So the light blue is state and local jobs. They did not fall as much. But what's been troubling, even though we've had such a tremendous recovery, what's been troubling me over the last few months is that the public sector jobs, again, those state and local jobs, have failed to really recover. They've been flat for much of the last year. So we think about state and local policy measures that we need to be able to take to see a full recovery. We need to make sure those dollars are being spent to boost employment in education, in public health, doing the things that can help the next time we have a recession and to help those workers retain their jobs. So now I want to turn to what's happened with the gender wage gap. And here I'm looking at a few different ways to look at the gender wage gap. And what we see here is that on average, the gender wage gap is about 20%. So women face about a 20% penalty compared to men, or On average, they're being paid about 80 cents on every dollar. We just had Equal Pay Day on March 15th, which was how far into 2022 women had to work to be paid as much as men were paid in just 2021. And so here you can see that at the bottom of the wage distribution, that's the 10th percentile there, the gender wage gap is still present, but it's much smaller than it is at the middle or at the top of the wage distribution. And by education, getting more education doesn't necessarily insulate you from a large gender wage gap. You can see it's persistent across all levels of education. And the gender wage gap is larger if you're Black or Hispanic. Compared to white men, Black and Hispanic women are paid much less. These are huge hourly wage penalties. And if you think about being paid over the year, this equates to thousands of dollars. One other statistic I want to point out is that we talk a lot about essential workers in the pandemic. And when we compare, sorry, I'm going to go to that one and I'm going to come back to this one. So we think about essential workers in the pandemic, we think about nurses and cashiers and childcare workers. Even in those very specific occupations, we can see that white men are paid significantly more than Hispanic women or Black women. So this inequality in wages, these wage gaps persist, even when you're looking at very small occupational classifications. And we've seen very little improvement over the last 50 years, 45, 50 years in closing the gender wage gap. The dark line represents the gender wage gap. The light blue line represents here the Black-white wage gap. And we can see there was some improvement in the earlier period in terms of closing and narrowing that gender pay gap. Much of that had to do with women entering professions that they hadn't entered before, entering the labor force at rates they hadn't before. And yet over the last almost 3 decades, we're seeing very little movement in the gender wage gap. It has been stagnant. And we look at the Black-white wage gap, we actually see that has widened over time. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about progress and what we can do. And there's clearly no silver bullet to solving pay equity. There's a menu of policy options that can close not only the gender pay gap, but also gaps by race and ethnicity. And we need to take steps to take all of those. So that includes requiring federal reporting of pay by gender, race, and ethnicity, prohibiting employers from asking about pay history, requiring employers to post pay bans when hiring, and adequately staffing and funding the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission and other agencies charged with enforcement of non-discrimination laws. We're going to get into a lot more policy options and many different pathways throughout this panel. And I turn back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Elise, for those remarks and framing the discussion for us. We're glad to have you on our panel as well. And I would now like to welcome our additional distinguished panelists. For their full bios, I encourage you to visit our website, which will be linked in the chat. First, we welcome Jessica Ramey Stender, Policy Director and Deputy Legal Director at Equal Rights Advocates, where she focuses on pay equity, sexual harassment, and pregnancy discrimination, and represents workers in employment discrimination cases. She also serves on the Equal Pay Today campaign. Next, we welcome Shayla Thompson, Senior Programs Manager at the National Employment Law Project, where she works to create and support policies and campaigns that uplift Black and Brown workers through legislative advocacy, research, and testimony. Her tenure at NELP has included projects committed to racial equity and healthful and safe workplaces. Welcome, Shayla. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Michelle McGrain, Director of Congressional Relations, Economic Justice at the National Partnership for Women and Families. Michelle directs legislative strategy within the organization's economic justice portfolio, with particular focus on paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, equal pay, pregnancy discrimination, and workplace harassment. Welcome, Michelle. Elise, our first question is for you. EPI has issued reports stating that raising the minimum wage would provide thousands of extra dollars to families every year and would help the federal budget, by reducing public assistance expenditure. Could you talk about why raising the minimum wage needs to be part of the push for economic justice, particularly for women?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I mentioned some specific policies that get directly at the gender wage gap. I think there are many other policies that we need to consider that will lift work wages for most workers while also reducing gender and racial ethnic pay gaps. So things like running the economy at full employment and protecting and strengthening workers' rights to bargain collectively for higher wages and benefits. But absolutely, on that list has to be raising the federal minimum wage. It would disproportionately lift wages for women because women are more likely to be low-wage workers. The wage gap is smaller at the lower end of the wage distribution because of that wage floor. Unfortunately, the federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour since 2009. Many states have tried to act when the federal government hasn't. Even just this year, 21 states increased their minimum wage. And research has shown that wage growth for low-wage workers has been markedly faster in states that have raised their minimum wage. So this would disproportionately benefit women and workers across the board, particularly those low-wage workers.
Thank you very much for that. In EPI's State of America Working Report, it's noted that while more education leads to better labor market outcomes in general, it does not inoculate workers against slow wage growth, the widening racial and gender wage gaps. What are some of the factors behind slow wage growth, particularly for women and BIPOC individuals?
You're exactly right. Workers can't simply educate themselves out of the gender wage gap or the racial wage gap. In fact, what you see is that pay gaps are often larger for women with higher levels of education than those with fewer formal education credentials. One statistic that I find so compelling is that men with a college degree are paid more on average than women with an advanced degree. So even with that extra degree, women still face enormous wage gaps. And as I said, they're paid on average. When you have a college degree, you're paid on average less than I'm going to say it right. Men with a college degree are paid more on average than women with an advanced degree. So getting that extra degree still doesn't get you as high as men are paid on average with one lower degree. So it is not insulating. It is often necessary to even reach equality.
That is very interesting. Jessica, Equal Rights Advocates prioritizes equal pay in eliminating the wage gap. As your website notes, the wage gap has barely budged in 15 years and is the largest for women of color. What is the current status of the wage gap and why has it been so tough for the needle to move on this issue?
There's a lot of big parts in that question. I think, first of all, it's helpful. We heard already from Elise kind of some of the contributors, and we'll talk more about that, to the overall gender and race wage gap. But I do think it's helpful to kind of talk about the actual status of the gap and what it means for real women and their families. We know that women are very often either the primary or the co-breadwinners in their families. So the wage gap isn't just a gender issue and it isn't just a women's issue, but it's an issue for all families and really economies throughout the country. So I just want to note that the overall wage gap for women average is 83 cents to the dollar compared to men. But when you take into account race and ethnicity, as we heard from Elise, it is much larger. And in fact, is in some cases, it's larger than it's ever been, especially because of what has happened in the last few years with COVID. So I want to quickly just note that while 83 cents to the dollar is for the average woman, AAPI women, it's just 75 cents to the dollar. Black women, white men, Black women, it's 57 cents to every dollar earned by white men. Native and Indigenous women, 50 cents. And Latinas are now just 49 cents to the dollar. So less than 50% of what their white male counterparts earn. And I think it's important to really emphasize what this means in their lives. So if you eliminated the wage gap, if it were fully eliminated, the average woman would have enough money for an additional year of childcare, another year of tuition at a 4-year public university, or full tuition at a 2-year college, more than 9 months of rent, 7 months of health insurance, and more than a year's worth of food. And so I just think it's critical that we really talk about what this means. Wages are not being paid to women, and that's affecting their ability to pay for basic living expenses, but also the ability to save money and create wealth. And the average wealth gap, as opposed to the wage gap, is much, much larger for women, and particularly women of color. You know, why it's so hard to move the needle, I think because there are so many structural barriers to addressing wage disparities. We've heard a little bit about caregiver discrimination and also lack of caregiving structures for workers who need it. Often it's women who have to take time out of the workforce to care for sick relatives or children, which then brings down their earnings. We heard about the minimum wage. There's also the tipped minimum wage that the majority of states allows tipped workers to be paid $2.23 an hour, and the majority of those people are women. There are many barriers to actually getting societal structures changed to ensure that these wage gaps are narrowed and eventually closed. And we really need kind of policies to be even more robust to fully address the gaps and close them. So we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those additional policies are. But I just wanted to weigh in on those for now, and then we'll add in some more legislative advocacy on this.
Thank you so much for putting that in context and what it really means for women on a daily basis to be paid so much less. Equal Rights Advocates also talks about an end to workplace segregation based on gender and race and ethnicity. Can you talk about what that means and how it will help reduce the wage gap?
Sure. Well, as you heard in Elisa's presentation, one of the big contributors and drivers of the overall gender and race-based wage gaps is this notion of occupational segregation, whereby women and women of color in particular are concentrated in lower paid industries and occupations. And we see that across industries, as you heard, but also even within companies, it is very common to see occupational segregation trends whereby women and people of color are concentrated in the lower paid jobs, and white people and men are often concentrated at the top. And there are many kind of barriers to addressing this type of occupational segregation that we see, particularly within companies. One of the big ones is a lack of transparency. And we know that one of the kind of key contributors to the ongoing wage gap is the fact that there is very little transparency around pay. And that can show up in a lot of ways. Workers often don't even know what their coworkers are making. So they may not know that they're earning less than their male counterpart. They may not know that they were skipped over for a promotion for the man, and that's resulted in their earning less than they should have. But in the context of occupational segregation, oftentimes employers themselves, especially in large companies, themselves may not be aware of this type of occupational segregation within their companies. And so for that reason, a lot of the policy advocacy that we at Equal Rights Advocates and our other colleagues in the equal pay advocacy community are pushing is to increase transparency. And one specific example that I will note is pay data collection and reporting. When you require employers to do an internal audit of their pay structures to determine where people are getting paid across race, gender, ethnicity, you will then see that often these trends of occupational segregation exist. But because employers don't always do those audits, they don't often know. And so when we have requirements in place for them to do that, we tried it at the federal level. It is currently on hold, but we have done it here in California, in Illinois, and we hope it will will happen in other states as well. We see that employers realize that they have these trends, and that can then instigate them to take steps to change their recruitment, their promotion, their retention policies to ensure that they have women and people of color represented at all levels throughout their company. So that type of transparency via pay data collection and reporting to agencies is one critical step to addressing occupational segregation. There are some more, but I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. I want to go back to your last answer. Could you just tell us a little bit about the wealth gap and why the wealth gap is so important?
Sure. I was just talking to someone the other day who kind of said, well, what is the wealth gap? And you hear a lot about the wage gap, which, as we've heard, is a very real issue of earnings being less for women than their male counterparts, and of course, much less for women of color, which is a problem, a huge problem. But the wealth gap is the money that you have to put away to retire, to address a medical or other emergency that you might not have planned for, any of those kinds of savings that we know that because of the wage gap and other kind of structural sexist and racist histories, women, and particularly women of color, have far, far, far less wealth than their male and especially white male counterparts. And so that issue of the wealth gap, I think, is one that we don't talk about enough, but is one that really means that women, and particularly women of color, do not have that safety net of funds to call upon should they need an emergency car repair or an emergency medical expense covered, or God forbid, they want to retire at a reasonable age. And I think that is one point of discussion that sometimes needs to be amplified a bit, of how much the wage gap contributes to that overall wealth gap.
Thank you. I thought that was really important to just circle back to for a minute. Shayla, your organization works to address the issue of temp and staffing work, which hyperfixates on profits at the expense of the basic workplace standards and fair wages, especially for workers of color and women. Could you please talk about how this gig or temp model is impacting economic justice?
Sure. Workers that are misclassified as gig, temp, or permatemp employees, which is the practice of placing a worker in a temporary role over a year or indefinitely. These workers are excluded from basic work rights like a minimum wage, overtime, Social Security, and the right to collectively bargain. Misclassification is prevalent in so many essential industries as well, some of which we're talking about this evening. Industries like home care, delivery, construction, warehouses, et cetera. Staffing agencies and host employers have created structures that leave these workers really susceptible to wage theft, retaliation, and poverty wages. Temporary employees are quite often being paid less money than their permanent counterparts without benefits for performing the exact same job duties. Temp Worker Justice, in partnership with NELP and several other worker orgs, released a national survey of temp workers this year, asking questions about pay, health and safety, benefits, discrimination, and retaliation. And of the over 1,300 temp workers from across 47 states, 71% reported facing employer retaliation for raising a workplace issue with a supervisor or management, and 24% of workers reported having wages stolen by their employer. Structural racism has segregated the entire labor economy, and how that shows up in the gig economy is Black and Latinx workers making up less than 29% of the workforce, but being 42% of workers on app-based or gig platforms. Latinx workers are 19.3% of all workers, but 17.9% of staffing agency workers as well. So a strong policy to support temp workers includes things like ensuring equal pay for equal work for temp workers, addressing discrimination by temp agencies, a ban on non-compete agreements, and health and safety training for all temp workers to reduce workplace hazards.
And are any of these policy initiatives in legislation right now? I mean, in the process of legislation?
Yes, there actually is federal legislation. The Restoring Worker Power Act is also known as the Temp Workers Bill of Rights. It was introduced last session and will be also introduced this session. So there is policy in combination with action being taken to support these workers for sure.
That's great. We'll follow that. So NELP also focuses on the issue of ensuring safe workplaces for all workers. Can you talk about how unsafe working conditions contribute to economic injustice in the workplace?
Yeah, even before the pandemic, unsafe working conditions were prevalent in workplaces that are predominantly occupied by workers of color and women, like we've already been discussing tonight. The pandemic made these conditions even worse and made it very clear that worker health is public health. the COVID crisis really magnified how little recourse workers have when facing unsafe or dangerous working conditions, illness, injury, or retaliation. Workers have always faced extraordinary obstacles to holding their employers accountable. And unfortunately, federal protections for workplace violations can be weak. We've also seen an amplification of how little recourse workers have when they're being mistreated on the job. Workers don't have a private right of action to sue their employers if they're violating law, even when their employer retaliates against them for expressing health and safety concerns. The only remedy is workers' compensation, which comes with its own set of systemic barriers. Workers have an administrative fix. They can file a complaint or they can request an inspection by OSHA. But even when workers are courageous enough to report violations or push back from employers, they're often unsupported. During COVID, many workers exercised their rights to speak out on the job, but unfortunately, a lot of them were ignored. And at NELP, we looked at a subset of COVID-19 whistleblower complaints. There were over 1,700 complaints, almost 2,000. Most of those complaints were dismissed or closed without investigation, and only 2% were resolved. And of that little amount, we don't know if the resolution was in favor of the workers because we don't have access to that data. So workers having little cover by laws or institutions, it continues to perpetuate a cycle of economic injustice, and it allows unsafe conditions in the workplace with a lack of accountability for bad employers to continue. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration is the agency that's tasked with ensuring healthy workplaces, but there are limitations to what an agency this small can do. So I think what we've seen across the country, we've seen organizing and advocacy across states, workers using their collective power to win health and safety rights. For example, worker-led health and safety councils to monitor enforcement, workers and their families in hard-hit industries like meatpacking, organizing to fight back against unsafe working conditions in plants, and a significant increase in boycotts and unionization across the country. So strong policy mixed with this type of collective action is what's really going to create a safer, just economy.
Thank you for that. That's very illuminating, eye-opening for me. Michelle, National Partnership was one of the leaders in the fight for the Family and Medical Leave Act and continues to advocate for access to paid family leave and paid sick days. So many women are in jobs without access to these basic rights. How does that contribute to the overall gender wage gap and economic injustice?
Sure. So like you mentioned, the National Partnership for Women and Families was one of the leading organizations that fought to pass the Family and Medical Leave Act nearly 30 years ago, all the way back in 1993. When we passed the Family and Medical Leave Act, it really was supposed to be a first step. It was not supposed to be the last step for the next 30 years. But since then, we've been working to both expand it and make it paid. The lack of pay attached to the Family and Medical Leave Act is one of the biggest reasons why people can't use it. But even on top of that, the way that the eligibility is structured, only just about over half of workers are eligible for the FMLA as it currently is written. So it was really groundbreaking, really culture changing, but does not go nearly far enough. And we need policy change to kind of fill in the gaps. So back to your question, kind of tying it to the gender wage gap, it really does, it really significantly hurts women's economic security and perpetuates the gender wage gap, the fact that we don't have paid family and medical leave. And I'll mention that only 23% of the workforce even has access to paid family leave. So while the wage gap exists really at every single age and stage of someone's career, we really see it widen when women have children. We call this the motherhood penalty, which is in stark contrast to what we call the fatherhood bonus. Women's wages go down when they have children and men's wages go up. So the lack of paid leave, both for caring for new children, but other family members as well, because women still hold a disproportionate share of caregiving responsibilities, whether it's for kids, parents, other family members. The lack of paid leave for caregiving really hurts women's wages by pushing them out of the workforce, hurting their chances at promotions, forcing them to cut their hours. And it fosters discrimination because an employer might say, oh, this woman is around that age, she might have a kid soon, let's not give her that promotion, let's not hire her, because women are the ones who need to take more time off. So I'm sure we all here agree that women really desperately need access to paid leave. But one thing I really want to emphasize, which I don't think is talked about enough, is that we also really need paid leave for men so that men start taking on a larger share of the caregiving responsibilities in their families. This would help relieve the burden on women to be the primary caregivers and could help tamp down on that discrimination that I just mentioned against women in the workplace by eroding the perception that women aren't as committed to their jobs because they have to spend too much time with their families. Once we normalize it across gender, then women won't be discriminated against for just taking care of their families. We also have found that, especially in opposite sex households, where one person needs to take on a larger share of caregiving responsibilities, a lot of the time it does default to the woman, both because of gendered, old-fashioned perceptions about who does what in families, but also because of the gender wage gap. So the gender wage gap is really a self-reinforcing mechanism where women are paid less to begin with, and then when one person in a household has to sacrifice their wages, it's going to be the person who's already making less, which causes them to continue to make less further down the road. So by extending access to paid leave for men, they can start to take more of those responsibilities and help women maintain their jobs, get that promotion, get that new job, keep their hours up. So, again, just to kind of sum up, we really do need policy solutions to change this. We, of course, need paid family and medical leave. We need a national policy. We have a number of states that have enacted these policies, 10 so far, including District of Columbia, and a couple more hopefully on the way. But we really do need a national guarantee so that every single working person in this country can access paid family and medical leave. We also need to expand the FMLA to kind of finally realize its full promise and expand protections to taking time off from work for all working people so that people will no longer have to choose between their families, their jobs, their income.
Thank you for that. And could you just maybe expound a little bit more on the issues that women who are pregnant or may become pregnant face in their workplaces?
Sure. So I do want to just say that, pregnancy discrimination is illegal under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. An employer is not allowed to fire someone because they're pregnant, even though we know that that still does frequently happen. But there's actually a really big loophole right now in the law. Employers are not actually required to accommodate their workers' pregnancies, which often forces pregnant workers to make a choice between keeping their job and staying healthy throughout their pregnancy. The only rule that's in place is that if an employer is providing similar accommodations to other workers for non-pregnancy related reasons, let's say someone had back surgery and they get an accommodation, they have to apply those same accommodations to pregnant workers. But that's really difficult to prove and just doesn't happen a lot of the time. And because pregnancy is a time-limited event, by the time someone is no longer pregnant, the case might still be ongoing. So all across the country, pregnant teachers are being denied extra bathroom breaks, pregnant grocery store clerks are denied a stool to sit on, and pregnant warehouse workers are denied the ability to switch to lighter duty roles during their pregnancy. And so, in talking about the wage gap and the motherhood penalty, this is one of the ways that those problems are kickstarted. When women are forced out of the workforce in order to stay healthy throughout their pregnancy, it impacts their earnings and their career potential for the rest of their lives. So there's a really simple fix to this, and it's called the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. This is a bipartisan bill with strong support from both Republicans and Democrats, and it would require employers to provide these, we call them reasonable accommodations, So again, bathroom breaks, water bottles, stools to sit on, switching to lighter duty. It would require employers to provide these accommodations to their pregnant employees as long as it wouldn't cause serious hardship to the business. So this bill has already passed the House, and we're really hopeful that given the recent emphasis on bipartisan legislation, that it will pass the Senate soon as well. It's really a no-brainer of an issue and would help pregnant workers immensely by allowing them to safely keep working throughout their pregnancies, and then would help their economic security throughout their lifetime by keeping them in the workforce, keeping them, earning wages and getting promotions and, keeping their hours, and kind of stopping some of that motherhood penalty that we see.
Thank you for that. This has all been really enlightening, and I thank you all for these thoughtful answers. I now have a few questions for the entire panel. We'll also be taking audience questions for the panelists in a few minutes. So audience, if you have any questions, please begin putting them in the question and answer box. So to all the panelists, the pandemic has had a blistering impact on our whole economy, but women have been particularly impacted and are left behind in the recovery. Many are involuntarily ending up in part-time work. In November 2021, women gained only 35% of the new jobs reported. Why are women having a tougher time getting back to the workplace? And are you worried about these trends in a post-pandemic world? And anyone can feel free to jump in. No takers?
I could start. I think, we've talked about a lot of the barriers that many workers face, but kind of disproportionately impact women. And I think that those barriers that in many senses and many reasons push women out of the workforce during COVID and even before still exist. And so although we are in a new phase of the COVID pandemic and we are hopefully on our way out, the same issues that were arising earlier still arise, where schools are sometimes closed or students are sent home from school because they are sick. A family member has COVID and needs to quarantine and needs someone to care for them. And that is still disproportionately falling on women to provide those types of caregiving responsibilities. So I think we have the issue of women not returning to the workforce because they are still facing those same barriers to being able to do so. We also have the same barriers that existed with regard to, as you just heard about, pregnancy. We know that some women are essentially forced out of jobs because they are pregnant. And so if they are either pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, that is another reason that they may sometimes not return to work. Some of the other kind of barriers to return that we touched on a little bit, but we haven't kind of dove into as much, is the lack of affordable childcare in this country, which has always been a problem. I think there is more discussion about it now because of the kind of federal proposals on that, which have unfortunately been stalled, but we will continue fighting for them. But the fact that there is a lack of affordable childcare and early education for families in this country means that, again, women are predominantly the ones who will take on the care of children when they can't afford childcare or find childcare. So those are some of the barriers that I know we've seen at Equal Rights Advocates and with our partners, but I'll turn it to my fellow panelists to add any other thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I just really want to emphasize everything that Jessica said. And just to, these problems all existed prior to the COVID pandemic. And so when we talk about, kind of returning to normal and going back to the way things were, normal and the way things were was already not working for women and really not working for women in the workforce. And so we really do need investments in paid family and medical leave, investments in childcare, investments in home and community-based services, so that women can actually have their families cared for while returning to work. And a lot of childcare facilities, frankly, were really struggling during the pandemic because they all had to shut down and some were not able to reopen. So that's another really huge, a huge piece of this, that we need that federal investment in our nation's care infrastructure to be able to build it back up to a place that actually is taking care of people in a way that's much different than what we saw before.
I think I'd just like to second those points that both of you made. I think that it's absolutely important that these problems existed before and the pandemic simply magnified them. If we look at the trends in what was happening with labor force participation, so women entered the labor force for decades, leading up to about 2000. And then over most of the last 20 years, even before the pandemic, women actually had not seen any gains, had actually seen some losses in terms of participating in the formal labor market. It's very different from some of our peer countries that have policies like much more affordable, high quality childcare, policies like paid family and medical leave. So you can see it directly in the evidence that what happened in the pandemic magnified what was already happening, and women just simply could not get a foothold in the formal labor market in the same way that they can in many other countries that have these social policies.
So how does sexual harassment and discrimination play into economic justice, particularly for women and in the service industry?
I'm happy to start on this one unless anyone else
Sure.
wants to.
Okay.
I mean, it's absolutely huge in the service industry, in every industry. I think we've talked about the tipped minimum wage already. If we eliminated the tipped minimum wage, then people in the service industry wouldn't have to put up with harassment just to be able to feed their families. And when women are harassed in the workplace, and not even just women, anyone based on any kind of identity that puts you at risk for harassment, whether it's gender, racial, sexual orientation, gender identity, it causes you a lot of times to make decisions about your career that are not the best ones for advancement. If you just need to get out of a particular workplace, you're not necessarily getting a promotion somewhere else. You might have to downgrade or cut your hours or leave a job soon after you started. And so it really is one of those compounding effects where you're losing out in the moment and you're losing out on future potential opportunities as well.
And this doesn't just occur in the service sector. This occurs across the economy. Harassment in the workplace. We think about occupational segregation and what can you do about it? One of the causes is harassment in the workplace. And those kinds of behaviors have driven many women outside of STEM professions, even if they have been educated and gotten degrees in those STEM fields. And then they work in fields that are a much less efficient match, are matches that don't provide the same kind of wages that they might have if they had been in those professions, if they hadn't been pushed out. So I think it's important to remember that occurs across the economy.
And I would just add the reality of retaliation in a lot of situations that workers face, but especially related to complaints about sexual harassment and other forms of harassment and discrimination is such that so often women and others who complain about or speak out about sexual harassment often face retaliation in a variety of forms. We have a hotline at Equal Rights Advocates where we hear from workers from across the country, mostly low-wage workers, but we hear from workers of all wages that report to us that when they speak out about harassment or complain to their supervisor or manager about harassment, very often they are the ones who are transferred to a less desirable shift or a less desirable position. They are the ones who get sometimes pushed out of a job altogether. And so I think this issue of retaliation and the toll that it takes on those who speak out about sexual harassment is really key to why it's so tied to economic security. You may take a pay cut or a worse position, you may be pushed out of your job, and that means that your paycheck is now either affected or no longer coming in simply because you chose to stand up for your rights in that regard.
So we've talked some about the imbalance in caregiving duties and how that contributes to economic injustice for women, but how about unpaid household work? What do y'all think about that?
If I could just respond with like a little bit of historical context around that. This is an injustice that goes back as far as the Roosevelt administration, when agricultural and domestic workers were carved out of New Deal policies. And sure, there have been some fixes to, New Deal era policies since then, but we're really still functioning in an economic system that was designed to exclude women and workers of color. So this also creates a injustice by devaluing this work. There are already harmful narratives steeped in misogyny and racism related to this type of work, and categorizes it as things like quote unquote women's work or low skill work. Yeah. So underpaying the communities of women that do caregiving and household work is a contribution to that devaluation, and it still perpetuates that racist framework that was created to exclude these women decades ago.
No, thank you for that context. Does anyone else want to jump in on that at all?
I guess I'll just add, there's a very insightful book, The Price of Motherhood, that recently was updated. And I think it's just important that we all recognize the actual cost of the caregiving responsibilities that are still predominantly borne by women. That is not to say it's the case in every situation, but that book and other kind of similar scholarship really lays out and quantifies how much women would be paid were they being paid for that work that they perform, unpaid work in the home. And so I think that's just kind of very illuminating for all of us to know what that unpaid labor actually would be the equivalent of were they to be actually monetarily compensated for that work, and the time it takes away from their ability to do other compensated work.
I have one last question for the panel, and then we're going to go to question and answer. Tell me, each of you, what legislative priorities you're emphasizing at the moment, and how can now members get involved in the fight for economic justice? I know we've talked about this some, but.
I can start. I've already mentioned it, but the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, like I said before, it's passed the House of Representatives. We're really hoping that it will come to the Senate floor soon for a vote. And there have been just a couple of really tiny changes. So if it passes the Senate, it needs to go back and pass the House one more time. But if anyone on here is represented by a Republican senator in particular, please reach out to them and urge them to, actually, no, Democrat or Republican, reach out to everyone. Reach out to your senator and say, please pass the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act and do it tomorrow. We need this. We needed it years ago. We need it as soon as possible. And then of course, some of the other issues we mentioned, and I'm sure Jessica and others will talk about the Paycheck Fairness Act, but we also need a national paid family and medical leave policy, a national paid sick days guarantee, and we need to expand the Family and Medical Leave Act, and we need to continue passing legislation to address harassment in the workplace.
That's a big priority list. We have a lot of work to do.
I'm happy to kind of follow that with, yes, the Paycheck Fairness Act at the federal level would provide much needed updates to the Federal Equal Pay Act, which was passed in 1963 and has not been amended since. And we know that the realities of the gender and racial wage gap require it to be strengthened in many ways. So that's a big one. I also wanted to note, in California, we are kind of in the beginning of our legislative session this year. One of the policy campaigns that we're leading at Equal Rights Advocates with partners is a major pay transparency bill. I'll put it in the chat, but it's SB 1162. It increases pay transparency in kind of a variety of ways. It would require employers to provide the salary range for any job in a job posting. It would require employers to make promotional opportunities known to and available to employees, existing employees, to try to address this issue of kind of a implicit or explicit bias functioning for a supervisor to determine who might be a good fit for a promotion, which is too often men. And then finally, it would require employers to report pay data for contract workers, not just their own employees. So like what Shayla was talking about, kind of workers who are hired through third-party staffing agencies who are often paid less, with worse benefits and worse treatment in general. They're also disproportionately workers of color, women, and LGBTQI people. So this bill would bring more transparency around their pay by requiring employers to report that pay data. And finally, it would make all of the pay data public. So somewhat similar to what we've seen in the UK and other countries, with the hope that when companies' pay data and gender and race wage gaps are public, it will incentivize them to take stronger steps to try to address those wage disparities. And just quickly responding to those questions, because it's related to legislation, there are efforts to increase accommodations for breastfeeding. There are protections already in place to allow workers to express breast milk, but there are also ongoing advocacy efforts to increase those protections and ensure that workers have a place that is not a bathroom or a supply closet where they can express breast milk. And finally, I'll put in the chat, if you want to hear about other ongoing legislative campaigns and how you can support them, you can join the Equal Rights Advocates Action Team and sign up to get action alerts from us about ongoing policy advocacy at the local, state, and national level to advance the rights of women and people across genders related to a lot of the issues we've been talking about today.
Elisa, you want to jump in?
Everything on the list that you have, I absolutely second. I don't want to repeat everything you've said. I think pay transparency, protections, all of those are absolutely essential. As I mentioned before, there's no silver bullet. We need to take all of these things at the federal, state, and local level if necessary. One thing that wasn't mentioned, I would say, is the PRO Act. I think that's very important, protecting the right to organize. And if you are in a union, we know that the wage gap is smaller. You have pay bands already. You have much more pay transparency. So you are accomplishing many of those goals in terms of being able to seek out pay and deal with harassment and so many other things that can be helped by having those kinds of protections. So I think that we need to make sure that we're putting forth legislation that will help workers organize and have those protections as well. So I just wanted to add that to the list.
And I will add just cause. At-will employment allows most workers to be fired from their job without explanation, pretty much for any legal reason. At-will employment gives employers even more power and control over workers, and it instills fear in the workplaces. It discourages workers from speaking up on the job about common violations like discrimination or a lack of health and safety protocols. A robust just cause policy, it includes things like giving workers a fair warning, adequate training, a chance to improve before firing them, ensuring there are disciplinary policies that are applied fairly and consistently, and providing severance pay for all discharged workers. There's no federal just cause legislation just yet, but there is just cause law for fast food workers in New York City and in Philly for parking workers. And there's a just cause campaign in Illinois right now. So we're continuing to create the narrative and support these local campaigns in hopes of getting some federal legislation. And of course, the Raise the Wage Act. We need to get a $15 federal minimum wage, and we absolutely need to eliminate the minimum wage for tipped workers and workers with disabilities.
I know we're getting near the end of our time, but Megan, do we have any questions in the question and answer?
Yes, we do. So one of our questions is from Carol M. And this person says, part, though not in all, but of the wage gap is due to women being in low wage jobs versus skilled trades like construction, plumbing, etc. Are there groups helping women to enter these industries, and are there ways that they can contribute, as in the public can contribute to such groups?
I can take that. That's a great question. We know that women are still extremely underrepresented in the construction and skilled trades jobs, which actually generally pay a living wage. Despite efforts to increase those numbers, they've stayed pretty low. It's still about 93% men. So there's a variety of groups that it would be great to get involved with. One of them is the National Task Force on Tradeswomen Issues. I serve on the policy committee as a co-chair of the policy committee of that task force. We would love for you to join the mailing list. There's a website, I'll put it in the chat, to learn how you can support access for women into the trades. Other groups that do kind of on-the-ground support for women to get into apprenticeships, which are kind of the key pathway into jobs in the construction trades. Just a few examples of those groups: Oregon Tradeswomen Inc. here in California, and the Chicago Women in the Trades. And those do a lot of active outreach in the community to let women know that these jobs are available, that they pay well, and help them gain the skills that they need and access they need to get into apprenticeship programs, pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs, such that they can actually get these jobs. So I'll put some of that information in the chat as well.
Thank you. Megan, do we have other questions?
Yes, we do. So our next question is from Janet S. And they're wondering, what about accommodations for breastfeeding mothers who return to work? You know, a private place to pump, access to the refrigeration, etc.
I think we talked about that a little, but does anyone want to expound on that a little?
I'll just add that there's another piece of bipartisan legislation called the PUMP Act that would strengthen protections for breastfeeding workers in the workplace.
All right, and maybe one more question, Megan?
Great. And then another question was from an anonymous attendee, but they were wondering that of the issues that we've kind of discussed tonight, could any of them be quote unquote fixed or maybe enforced by also enforcing the ERA?
What do y'all think?
Well, I would just say at this point, I guess the effort is ongoing to actually get the ERA enacted. And there is a very strong coalition, the ERA coalition, that maybe some of you all are a part of, that is still working to actually pass that and then eventually hopefully enforce it. And I think there is, I know we are at time, there is an argument that having that protection in the Constitution would enable us to push for stronger policies to support women. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that. But I'll put the ERA Coalition contact information in the chat as well if you want to get involved.
And now is very engaged with the ERA Coalition and working on ERA work. So our members are very active on that issue.
We have to remember that, sorry, I think that having the laws in place is important. Also making sure that we have money for enforcement of those laws, I think, is also, on each of those areas, making sure that there's money there to enforce what's being put forward. I didn't mean to interrupt, just wanted to get that in.
No, that's a very important point. So thank you all once again for your answers, for your valuable insights. We've learned a lot. We've heard some grim statistics and had our eyes open to the nuances of many of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing in our fight for economic justice. Due to structural, misogynistic, and racist systems, women are denied economic security from their very first paycheck through to their retirement. The fact is that equal pay is a life or death issue for women. We can no longer wait for economic justice. NOW has a long history of advocating for a wide range of these issues, including earning a living wage, preventing job discrimination, and ensuring pay equity, Social Security, pension reform, and more. From the early days, when we successfully litigated to desegregate help wanted ads by gender, to helping enact the FMLA and helping to raise the minimum wage in numerous states, there is much to cheer, yet we know there is so much more to do. We must finally close the ridiculously stubborn wage gap, provide high quality, affordable childcare, paid medical and family leave. We must address the insidious threats of sexual harassment and discrimination that occur in so many workplaces and keep women from reaching their full potential. We must remove the numerous imbalances in our homes that are driving women out of the workforce. And we must have a national minimum wage that provides fair compensation to millions of women, especially women of color and those in service industries. We, along with the partners you have just heard from tonight, will continue to demand that the Biden-Harris administration and Congress push for real transformative change that will truly lift families out of poverty and provide the support they need to create an economically just future. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you at future events. We also hope to welcome you as partners in our fight for economic justice. If you aren't already a member, please join now and get involved. Sign up to receive our updated information on economic justice as well as our other core issues. And you can find more information at now.org. You can follow us at National Now on social media channels and subscribe to our email alerts. So I really appreciate everyone joining us tonight, and I hope you have a very pleasant evening. Thank you.